So imagine a country that, well, on paper at least, has absolutely everything going for it.
Right, you're talking about the absolute dream scenario for an emerging market.
Exactly. I mean, you have a massive young labor force. You sit geographically right next door to the single largest consumer market on the planet.
Which is a huge advantage.
Massive. And, your land is just packed with abundant natural resources.
Everything from oil to precious metals.
Yeah, so if an economist were drawing up a blueprint for, like, rapid, unstoppable growth, this is exactly what it would look like. You would expect an absolute powerhouse.
You really would. All the inputs are perfectly aligned for an economic explosion.
But then, you look at the reality of Mexico over the last few decades, and
Yeah.
you realize the engine just isn't behaving the way the blueprint dictates.
Not at all.
Because between 1994 and 2019, annual economic growth averaged just 2.5%.
Which, I mean, that might sound stable to someone living in a fully developed, mature economy.
Right, like the US or Germany or something.
Yeah. Exactly. But for a developing nation with a growing population and that much built-in advantage, 2.5% is incredibly sluggish.
It's basically,
It's essentially treading water.
yeah, treading water. And if you're a citizen living in that economy, you feel that stagnation in your bones.
Oh, absolutely. It affects everything.
Because over that same 25-year stretch, per capita income, the actual money in people's pockets rose at less than 1% a year.
Wow. Less than 1%.
Yeah. I mean, think about that. If you started working in 1994, by the time you've put in a quarter century of labor, your fundamental standard of living has barely budged.
It's incredibly frustrating for the workforce.
And then, right before the chaos of the 2020s hit, Mexico's GDP growth in 2019 actually went slightly negative. It shrank by 0.06%.
And that 2019 figure is, well, it's the critical baseline for anyone trying to understand this situation.
Right, because it was before the pandemic.
Exactly. It tells us that the friction in this economic engine wasn't caused by some sudden external global shock.
It wasn't a fluke.
No, the structural roadblocks were already there. They were slowly grinding the gears to a halt long before the world shut down.
So today, welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive.
Yeah.
We are going to unpack this paradox. We're going to explore how a country manages its massive national checkbook, dive into the wild, and honestly, completely counterintuitive mechanics of global trade and currency.
The currency stuff is fascinating.
It really is. And we'll look at the brutal reality of who wins and who loses in massive free trade agreements. And finally, examine the grassroots financial interventions trying to pull millions out of the informal cash economy.
And the goal here, for you listening, is to bridge that gap between those massive, abstract, macroeconomic data points and the actual reality on the street.
Because the big numbers can be misleading.
Right, because billions of dollars in foreign investment don't really mean much if they never change the daily calculus for the average family.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think we need to start with the national checkbook.
That's the best place to begin.
Because before we can even look at how Mexico trades with the United States or the rest of the world, we have to look at how the government funds itself.
The internal budget.
Yeah. And the data from our sources shows a classic, incredibly dangerous fiscal squeeze.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It really is. The cost of running the country, infrastructure, healthcare, education, is steadily rising.
As it naturally does with a growing population.
Right. But tax revenue is either flat or actually dropping.
And it's a dynamic that forces a government into a corner. I mean, when your monthly expenses outpace your monthly income, whether you're a household or a sovereign nation, you only have one immediate option.
You borrow.
Exactly. You run a budget deficit, and your national debt begins to climb.
But it's not just a standard tax collection issue here, is it? There's a massive glowing vulnerability in where that revenue actually comes from.
Oh, absolutely. The revenue concentration is terrifying.
Because in 2019, roughly 30% of Mexico's total government revenue came from one single place.
The state-owned oil sector.
30%. From oil.
Yeah. And relying on a single commodity for a third of your national budget is an incredibly precarious position.
I mean, it's basically tying your entire domestic agenda, like building new schools, paving highways, paying doctors, to a global commodities market that is famously volatile.
It's a huge gamble. And, it's not just the standard boom and bust cycle of oil anymore.
Right. The world is changing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are in the middle of a massive global pivot toward renewable energy.
So the long-term trend is...
The long-term structural trend for oil is a phase-out.
Wow. So if you're a government planner and you know that the asset funding 30% of your budget is slowly becoming obsolete, that's not just a budget shortfall.
No, it's not.
That's an existential crisis.
Precisely. You're looking at a future where that revenue stream dries up, but the citizens still need hospitals and roads.
They don't stop needing basic services just because oil prices drop.
Right. So unless there is a radical diversification of how the state collects revenue, say, through fundamentally overhauling the income tax system or formalizing the millions of off-the-books businesses, that structural deficit is going to widen dramatically.
Wait, okay, so if the revenue is already that precarious, what happens when a recession hits? Because our sources mention the International Monetary Fund forecast that Mexico's government debt would stabilize around 65% of its GDP in the mid-2020s.
Yeah, that was the IMF projection.
So if I'm hearing you right, the government is already struggling to pay its bills.
Yeah.
A recession hits, tax revenue plummets even further, and debt spikes to 65% of the entire economy. Isn't that just a fast track to a total financial collapse?
Well, it looks terrifying on paper, I'll give you that. But this is where we have to look at the internal engineering of a modern economy.
Okay.
Because the government doesn't just passively watch a recession happen and do nothing.
They react.
Well, not even react in the sense of passing new laws. What's fascinating here is that the system has built-in mechanisms designed to prevent a collapse.
Right.
They're known as automatic stabilizers.
Automatic stabilizers. Break that down for me. How do those actually work?
So think about the mechanics of a recession. Businesses see a drop in orders, right?
Yeah, people start buying stuff.
So they scale back production, they lay off workers.
Makes sense.
And as people lose their paychecks, the total national income drops. Now, because income drops, the amount of income tax the government collects automatically drops with it.
Oh, I see.
The legislature doesn't have to meet and pass a law to cut taxes.
They don't have to debate it for months.
Exactly. The tax burden naturally shrinks because there is literally less wealth to tax.
Okay, so that's the revenue side. The government bleeds cash. That sounds bad.
Right. But simultaneously, the spending side reacts. When those workers lose their jobs, they suddenly qualify for government assistance.
Like unemployment benefits.
Exactly. Unemployment benefits, food assistance, whatever social safety nets are in place. So government spending automatically shoots up.
Again, without politicians having to debate an emergency relief bill while people go hungry.
Yeah.
It just naturally kicks in.
Yes. So tax revenue plunges, government spending spikes, and the budget deficit widens significantly in the short term.
Because they're borrowing to cover the difference.
The government takes on a surge of new debt to fund those unemployment checks. And that is why you see the IMF closely watching that debt-to-GDP ratio creep up toward 65%.
You know, it sounds a lot like the suspension system on a car.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Like, if the economy is a car speeding down the highway, a recession is a massive, unexpected pothole.
Right.
And if you have no suspension, like no automatic stabilizers, the rigid chassis takes the full, violent force of the drop.
The impact translates directly to the frame.
Exactly. The axles snap, the car flips, and the passengers inside, who are the citizens, are just completely devastated.
That's a very accurate way to visualize it. A rigid economy without safety nets turns a mild downturn into a catastrophic depression.
But with a suspension system, when the tire hits the pothole, the springs and shocks instantly compress.
They absorb the blow.
Right. That compression is the government taking on rapid debt, the deficit widening. It's absorbing the kinetic energy. The car dips. It's a jarring ride for the passengers, sure, but the vehicle doesn't break apart.
It stays intact.
And most importantly, it maintains forward momentum. By giving unemployed people money, they can still go to the grocery store. The grocery store stays open, the suppliers keep shipping food, and the entire system doesn't just freeze up.
And that forward momentum is everything. The automatic stabilizers ensure a baseline level of consumption remains in the economy.
Which keeps things alive.
But you pointed out the vulnerability earlier. The debt load. You can't drive on fully compressed springs forever.
Right, because eventually the shocks just break.
Exactly. The automatic stabilizers are a temporary bridge. The economy has to recover. Businesses have to start hiring again so that tax revenues eventually rise, unemployment payouts fall, the deficit shrinks, and the springs decompress.
So it's a tightrope.
A massive tightrope. Mexico has to rely on these debt-funded shock absorbers while knowing that 30% of its normal fuel, that oil revenue, is slowly evaporating in the background.
Which means the internal checkbook is under immense pressure. But a country doesn't exist in a vacuum.
No, it doesn't.
It's constantly interacting with the global market. And the world is judging its economic health every second of the day through the value of its currency.
The exchange rate. It's basically the translator between the domestic economy and the rest of the world.
And Mexico's peso has been a floating currency since 1994, right?
Yes, meaning its value isn't pegged or guaranteed by the central bank. It fluctuates based entirely on the ruthless supply and demand of global currency traders.
And we saw a really wild fluctuation recently in the data. In March 2020, the peso dropped violently.
It's a huge swing.
It went from about 18 pesos to buy $1, plummeting to 25 pesos for a single dollar in just a matter of days.
And a depreciation of that magnitude in such a short window is a seismic event for an economy.
I can imagine.
It radically alters the purchasing power of every citizen and every business in the country almost overnight.
Okay, let's play this out logically, because my instinct says this should actually be a secret weapon for Mexico's economy.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, if the peso becomes significantly cheaper compared to the dollar, then Mexican exports, let's say refrigerators assembled in Monterrey, suddenly become incredibly cheap for American buyers.
Because the dollar goes further.
Right. Americans should be flooding across the border with their strong dollars to buy up everything. At the same time, American imports become way too expensive for Mexicans, so they stop buying foreign goods. Doesn't a cheaper currency instantly create a massive trade surplus?
It is entirely logical to assume that. The price drops, the demand should spike, and the trade deficit should vanish.
But the data tells a completely different story.
It does.
Throughout 2020, right after this massive currency depreciation, Mexico's trade deficit actually got worse.
The gap widened.
It widened. It wasn't until April 2021, over a year later, that the trade balance finally flipped into a surplus driven by manufactured goods. So my question is, why did it get worse before it got better? It feels like the fundamental laws of supply and demand just broke down.
They didn't break, they were just caught in traffic, so to speak.
Caught in traffic.
Yeah. What you're describing is a classic macroeconomic phenomenon known as the J-curve effect.
The J-curve.
Right. And to understand it, we have to pull back from pure economic theory and look at how international logistics actually operate in the real world. Trade isn't a guy walking into a store and spontaneously deciding to buy a cheaper TV.
No, we're talking about massive multinational supply chains.
Exactly. Think about a Mexican logistics company that relies on imported specialized machinery from Germany.
Okay.
They don't buy that machinery on a whim. They signed a legally binding contract 6 months ago, locking in the purchase.
The contracts. They don't care what the peso did yesterday.
Exactly. When the peso plummeted from 18 to 25 against the dollar in March 2020, those contracts didn't evaporate.
They still have to pay.
The Mexican company is still legally obligated to import that German machinery. So the physical volume of goods crossing the border doesn't change one bit in the short term.
Wow.
But because the peso is now much weaker, that Mexican company has to spend drastically more pesos to fulfill the exact same contract.
So they are importing the exact same amount of physical stuff, but their national import bill is suddenly through the roof.
Yes. And the exact same friction applies to their exports.
How so?
Well, say a Mexican auto parts manufacturer has a year-long contract to supply steering wheels to Detroit at a set volume. Even though the peso is cheaper now, Detroit doesn't instantly demand twice as many steering wheels tomorrow.
Right, because the assembly lines run at a fixed pace. They don't need double the steering wheel.
Exactly. So the volume of export stays flat, the volume of import stays flat, but the cost of the imports has skyrocketed.
No wonder the deficit widened.
Right. Economists describe this rigid, short-term reality by saying that the demand for imports and exports is initially inelastic.
Inelastic, meaning it doesn't stretch or change easily.
Exactly. People and businesses aren't flexible enough to immediately change their buying habits based on the new exchange rate. There's actually a formal threshold for this, often referred to conceptually as the Marshall-Lerner condition.
Marshall-Lerner condition.
Yeah, it basically says that a weaker currency will only help your trade balance if buyers and sellers are highly responsive to price changes.
And in the short term, with millions of tons of cargo already on ships and legally bound by contracts, nobody's responsive.
Nobody.
The country just bleeds cash and the trade balance dips downwards. That's the bottom hook of the letter J on a graph.
You've got it. That downward dip is the short-run pain. But then, as we move into the long run, the landscape shifts.
Because the contracts run out.
Exactly. Those old contracts finally expire. Corporate purchasing managers in the U.S. and Canada sit down to plan the next year, and they look at Mexico and realize, oh, Sourcing from there is incredibly cost-effective now.
So they sign new, much larger contracts. The volume of exports finally surges.
While simultaneously, Mexican businesses and consumers, exhausted by the high price of imported goods, find local domestic alternatives.
So the volume of imports drops.
Yes. The conditions of the market become flexible, the trade balance starts to swing upward, crosses the break-even point, and rockets into a surplus, drawing the long stem of the J.
Which aligns perfectly with the data showing that strong rise in manufactured exports by April 2021.
Exactly.
You know, what's fascinating here is how much time it takes to turn the ship. We're talking about a lag of over a year where the domestic economy just has to eat the higher costs before the benefits kick in.
It's a painful lag.
It is. And speaking of domestic survival during that lag, we have to talk about how the average Mexican family navigates this because it ties directly into a massive macroeconomic lifeline.
Oh, you're pointing toward remittances and the current account.
Yes, I am. Because
Okay.
the trade balance just tracks the physical stuff, cars, avocados, machinery. But the current account is the broader measure of all money flowing in and out of the country.
It's the bigger picture.
Right. Mexico had a current account deficit of negative 0.46% of GDP in 2010. By 2019, it had narrowed to negative 0.33%.
Which is an improvement.
It is. But that improvement wasn't just because of factories exporting goods. A massive chunk of that gap was closed by net remittances.
Remittances. They are one of the most vital and, frankly, deeply human elements of global economics.
They really are.
We are talking about money sent back home by citizens working abroad.
Right, like a guy working construction in Dallas or picking fruit in California's Central Valley, taking a percentage of his wages every Friday, going to a wire service and sending it back to his mother in Michoacan.
Exactly. And when you look at an individual $200 wire transfer, it's a microeconomic family matter.
Just a son helping his mom.
But when you aggregate the millions of Mexicans working overseas, sending a portion of their income back week after week, you are looking at tens of billions of dollars.
It's a staggering amount of money.
It's a torrential river of foreign capital injecting itself directly into the Mexican economy.
And the beauty of it, from a macroeconomic perspective, is that Mexico didn't have to manufacture or export a single physical product to get those dollars.
Nothing. It's pure capital inflow.
It acts as a massive stabilizer.
It really does. It props up the current account. It provides a floor for the value of the peso. And perhaps most crucially, the money bypasses the government and large corporations entirely.
It goes straight to the people,
It lands directly on the kitchen tables of low and middle income families.
who immediately spend it. I mean, they buy groceries at the local market, they hire a neighbor to fix their roof, they pay school fees.
Yeah.
The multiplier effect on the local community is enormous.
It is a phenomenal engine for poverty alleviation.
Mhm.
However, if we step back and look at the whole picture, the sheer scale of these remittances is also an indictment of the domestic economy.
How so?
Well, the reason those billions of dollars are flowing back is because millions of prime-age workers had to leave their country to find a living wage in the first place.
Right, because the domestic economy wasn't generating enough opportunity,
Exactly.
which is the perfect pivot to our next major area of focus. If we want to understand why there weren't enough good jobs at home, we have to look at the engine that was supposed to industrialize Mexico and bring it into the first world.
The massive free trade agreements.
Yes. You cannot separate the modern Mexican economy from the history of North American free trade.
It is the defining architecture of the last 3 decades.
So let's go back to the starting line. 1994, the implementation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
A historic moment.
The U.S., Canada, and Mexico essentially erased the borders for commerce. They eliminated the vast majority of tariffs, the taxes that usually penalize imports and exports.
And the theory was integration. By removing tariffs, you allow supply chains to stretch across the continent to find the ultimate efficiency.
And if you just look at the raw volume, it looks like a historic triumph. I mean, over the 25-year lifespan of NAFTA, trade between the three countries didn't just inch up, it tripled.
Tripled. That's massive.
Mexico became the ultimate low-cost manufacturing hub. Foreign companies flooded the country with foreign direct investment, or FDI.
And we should clarify FDI for a second.
Sure.
This isn't Wall Street traders buying Mexican stocks on a computer screen. This is a German automaker physically breaking ground in Puebla, pouring concrete, building a billion-dollar assembly plant, and installing heavy machinery.
Real physical infrastructure.
Exactly. It is highly committed, illiquid capital.
And by the 2010s, Mexico was pulling in roughly $30 billion of this FDI every single year. You look at that and think, mission accomplished, the country is rich.
It certainly sounds like it.
But when you dig into the localized data from our sources, the story of NAFTA is really a tale of two entirely different Mexicos.
The geographic and economic divide that NAFTA accelerated is profound.
Let's look at the winners first. The North. The states relatively close to the U.S. border.
Right.
This region absorbed almost all of that $30 billion in FDI. Entire cities transformed into high-tech manufacturing clusters.
Yeah, if you got a job in an automotive plant in Monterey, your productivity skyrocketed because you were suddenly working with world-class robotics.
And your wages increased compared to local alternatives. You basically became part of the global middle class.
But the architecture of NAFTA left massive swaths of the country completely exposed.
And this is where it gets tough.
It does. Because
Okay.
if you look at the largely agricultural south of Mexico, the narrative flips entirely.
Right, and we need to be very clear about how this happened, just reporting the facts neutrally.
Right.
While massive corporate farms in Mexico saw an increase in exporting things like tomatoes and avocados to the U.S., the traditional, smaller-scale Mexican farmer was absolutely decimated.
Specifically, the millions of families relying on corn production.
Yeah. Why corn?
Because when NAFTA eliminated the tariffs on agricultural goods, it opened the floodgates. The U.S. government heavily subsidizes its domestic agriculture industry.
So American farmers get money from the government to grow corn.
Yes, so they can sell their corn at artificially low prices. Suddenly, a small farmer in Oaxaca is trying to sell his crop at the local market, but he's competing against a tidal wave of subsidized American corn pouring across the border, tariff-free.
Wow. It's just not a fair fight.
Not at all.
The Mexican farmer can't lower his prices enough to compete without starving. So farms go bankrupt, livelihoods are destroyed, and you have massive displacement.
It's tragic.
This is a classic example of why economists say free trade creates winners and losers. The overall economy might have grown, but the local devastation in the South was very real.
It illustrates the concepts of trade creation versus trade diversion. Trade creation is the good part, finding the most efficient place to build a car.
But trade diversion,
Well, the liberalization of trade requires an incredibly proactive domestic government to step in and catch the losers. If the state doesn't retrain those displaced farmers or build new industries in the South, the inequality just calcifies. It becomes permanent.
and there was another massive promise made by the architects of NAFTA that just never really materialized.
The convergence of wages?
Right. The entire pitch was, if we open the borders to trade, American and Canadian companies will rush to Mexico to hire cheaper labor.
Which they did.
Right. But the theory was that this massive surge in demand for Mexican workers would naturally force wages up until they started to mirror wages in the U.S.
That was the expectation.
But a quarter century later, a massive wage gap remains. A Mexican auto worker assembling a truck makes a fraction of what an American auto worker makes assembling the exact same truck.
And that persistent failure of the free market to organically raise Mexican wages eventually became politically untenable.
It forced a change.
Exactly. Which leads to the renegotiation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. In 2020, NAFTA was formally scrapped and replaced by the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
And it was far more than just a rebranding exercise. The USMCA represents a fundamental philosophical shift in how the three countries manage their economic relationship.
They updated a lot of things to fit the 21st century, right?
Yeah.
Rules for digital trade, data localization, financial services, things that the internet made relevant long after 1994.
Right. Standard modernizations.
But the core mechanism they altered was the rules of origin.
Yes. Rules of origin are basically the fine print of free trade. They dictate exactly how much of a product must be manufactured within the borders of the U.S., Mexico, or Canada to qualify for zero tariffs.
Okay, so under NAFTA, a company could theoretically buy a ton of incredibly cheap components from Asia, ship them to Mexico for final assembly, and then sell the finished product tariff-free into the U.S.
Exactly.
The USMCA tightened those rules drastically, forcing companies to source more of their core components from within North America.
But the most radical shift in the USMCA isn't just about where the parts come from. It's about how much the person making them gets paid.
I still can't believe this is real policy. Under the USMCA, 40% of the value of the components in every single vehicle exported from Mexico must be manufactured by workers earning a minimum of $16 per hour.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Let's really pause and think about the magnitude of that mandate. $16 an hour.
In a country where the standard minimum wage and the average manufacturing wage is a tiny fraction of that. I mean, the entire gravitational pull of Mexico for the last 30 years was its status as a low-cost location.
By embedding a $16 an hour wage floor into an international trade treaty, the USMCA is officially abandoning the laissez-faire approach of NAFTA.
They're not waiting around anymore.
Exactly. They are no longer waiting for the invisible hand of the market to slowly raise wages in Mexico. They are using the blunt force of international law to artificially intervene.
It's essentially the U.S. and Canada looking at Mexico and saying, you want continued tariff-free access to our massive consumer markets? Fine. But you can no longer compete purely by suppressing the wages of your labor force. You have to share the profits.
It is a profound attempt to engineer a middle class. And for the Mexican workers who secure and keep those industrial jobs, their incomes are absolutely going to rise.
That's life-changing money for them.
It is. But when you artificially manipulate the price of labor that dramatically, you have to watch out for the ripple effects.
Right, because corporations aren't charities. If a car company suddenly has to pay $16 an hour in Mexico, do they just accept lower profit margins?
Usually not.
Or do they aggressively automate the assembly lines with robotics to hire fewer workers?
Yeah.
Or do they look at the math and say, if we have to pay $16 an hour anyway, we might as well just move the factory back to Ohio?
That is the tightrope. If the mandate works, it builds a robust Mexican middle class that can buy more domestic and foreign goods. If it backfires, it accelerates automation and strips jobs away.
It's a high-stakes experiment.
It really is. But even in the best-case scenario, the USMCA's wage mandate only targets a very specific slice of the economy.
Just.
Formal industrial manufacturing workers, largely in the north.
Which begs the massive, glaring question.
Yeah.
What about everybody else?
Exactly.
What about the displaced farmers in the South? What about the millions of people who aren't working in formal factories?
And this brings us to the most persistent structural flaw in the Mexican economic engine.
Inequality.
Pervasive systemic inequality.
Let's look at the broad demographic and health data over the last decade. From 2010 to 2019, Mexico's population grew significantly, reaching about 128 million people.
Oh, huge labor pool.
And their Human Development Index, or HDI, which factors in life expectancy, years of schooling, and gross national income, improved from 0.748 to 0.779.
Now, the HDI improvement is a solid macro indicator. It means that, on average, citizens are living slightly longer, getting slightly more education, and generating slightly more wealth. The country is absolutely moving forward.
But the metric that truly defines the lived experience of that economy is the Gini coefficient.
Yes, the Gini coefficient.
The data shows Mexico's Gini coefficient dropped from 0.472 in 2010 down to 0.454 in 2019. Now, I know a drop in the Gini coefficient is technically a good thing, but we need to translate what that number actually represents in the real world.
Sure. So the Gini coefficient is how economists measure the gap between the richest and the poorest within a society.
Okay.
The scale goes from 0 to 1. A score of exactly 0 is a society with perfect equality. Every single citizen, from the janitor to the CEO, takes home the exact same amount of money.
A total statistical impossibility in the real world.
Right. And a score of exactly 1 is absolute terrifying inequality. One single person holds 100% of the nation's wealth, and the other 127 million people have absolutely nothing.
Also impossible, but a scary thought. So a score of 0.454 means Mexico is hovering somewhere in the middle, but leaning heavily toward the unequal side.
Economists visualize this using the Lorenz curve.
The Lorenz curve.
Imagine a perfectly straight diagonal line rising at a 45-degree angle on a graph. That straight line represents perfect equality.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The actual distribution of wealth in that country is mapped as a curved line that sags below that straight diagonal. The deeper the sag, the worse the inequality.
So the wealthiest few percent are hoarding a massive portion of the income, dragging the curve down.
Exactly. When Mexico's Gini score dropped from 0.472 to 0.454, it meant that sagging curve pulled up just a tiny fraction of an inch closer to the straight line of equality.
So the distribution of wealth became slightly more equitable over that decade.
Slightly, yes.
But 0.454 is still incredibly high compared to fully developed economies. The gap between the billionaire telecommunications executives in Mexico City and the rural farmers in Chiapas is still a canyon.
A massive canyon.
Why is that inequality so stubbornly resistant to change, even with billions in foreign investment.
Because the modern, formalized export economy of the North is essentially walled off from the rest of the country. Inequality persists because of two massive, intertwined domestic hurdles:
We are.
deeply underdeveloped financial institutions in rural areas and the sheer size of the informal sector.
The informal sector. We've danced around this term, but let's define it. We are talking about the shadow economy.
Exactly.
Street food vendors, day laborers, unregistered repair shops, domestic workers, people working entirely in cash, completely off the books.
They don't pay income tax, which starves the government budget we talked about earlier.
Right, the tax revenue problem.
But more importantly for the individual, they operate entirely outside the legal and financial system. If you run an unregistered, informal business, you cannot walk into a commercial bank and ask for a loan to expand your operations.
Because you have no documented income history. The bank views you as a ghost.
Exactly. You can't get a business loan, you can't get insurance, you have no legal recourse if a supplier cheats you. Your productivity is artificially capped because you are locked out of the tools of modern capitalism.
Which makes a top-down solution almost impossible. I mean,
Wow.
you can't just mandate higher wages for these people through the USMCA because they aren't on any corporate payroll.
No, the treaties don't touch them.
So how do you fix it? This brings us to a really fascinating grassroots intervention from the sources. If the macro-level free trade agreements can't reach these people, you have to go micro.
You have to bypass the traditional financial system entirely.
Let's talk about the Expanding Rural Finance Project. Between 2016 and 2020, this initiative specifically targeted the deep rural areas of Mexico, places where commercial banks don't even bother to build branches because it's not profitable.
Financial deserts.
Right. And over 4 years, this project dispersed over 170,000 individual loans. And the most striking detail to me is the size of the loans. The average was just $1,850.
When we've been discussing $30 billion in annual foreign investment, a loan of $1,800 sounds almost like a rounding error.
It really does. It seems
Mhm.
tiny. But look at the demographics of who received this money. 76% of the recipients were in deep rural areas, and crucially, 81% of the loan recipients were women.
That's a very specific targeting strategy.
So why target that specific demographic with such small amounts of capital? What is an $1,800 loan actually going to achieve?
This raises an important question, and it cuts to the absolute core of development economics. To understand why this works, we have to map out the poverty cycle.
The poverty cycle.
It is a vicious, self-perpetuating loop that traps families for generations.
Walk me through the loop.
Let's use the exact demographic targeted by the loans. Imagine a rural woman running an informal agricultural business. Maybe she raises a small flock of chickens or grows vegetables on a small plot of land. Because she is in the informal sector, her productivity is low, which means her income is incredibly low. She earns just enough cash to feed her family today.
Which means at the end of the week, her savings are zero. Every peso went into survival.
Exactly. Because she has zero savings, and because the commercial banks won't talk to her, her ability to make an investment is zero.
And without investment, you're stuck.
In economics, investment is the only way to grow. There are two types: physical capital and human capital.
Break those down.
Physical capital is tools, a better irrigation pump, a motorized tiller, a commercial-grade sewing machine. Human capital is knowledge and health, paying for a training course or keeping her children in school instead of pulling them out to work in the fields.
But you can't afford any of that.
Because she can't invest in capital, she has to continue doing everything by hand, highly inefficiently. Her productivity remains stagnant.
Right.
Because her productivity is stagnant, her output remains low, which brings us full circle. Her income remains low. It is an inescapable trap.
Income to zero savings to zero investment to low productivity back to low income. The wheel just keeps spinning.
Until you inject external friction. That is what the $1,800 microloan does. It artificially breaks the loop at the savings and investment node.
Oh, I see.
You hand that rural entrepreneur a lump sum of capital that she didn't have to spend 5 years starving to save up.
And suddenly, her reality shifts overnight. She takes that $1,800 and buys the motorized irrigation pump. She buys high-yield seeds and fertilizer.
That is the injection of physical capital, and instantly, her productivity spikes.
Because she has the tools now.
The pump waters her crops in a fraction of the time, leading to a larger harvest. Higher productivity inevitably results in a higher output, which finally breaks the cycle and generates a higher income.
But why target women specifically? 81% of these loans went to women.
Because decades of empirical data in development economics have proven that men and women generally spend windfall income differently.
Really? How so?
When a woman in a developing economy sees an increase in her income, she is statistically far more likely to reinvest that surplus into human capital, specifically the health, nutrition, and education of her children.
Oh, wow. So by targeting the mother, the $1,800 loan doesn't just buy a water pump today, it ensures her kids finish high school tomorrow.
Exactly.
It creates a generational multiplier effect that lifts the entire village.
It formalizes their economy from the ground up. It proves that changing a nation's Gini coefficient doesn't always require a continent-spanning trade treaty negotiated by diplomats.
Sometimes the big treaties miss the mark entirely for these people.
Right. Sometimes it just requires trusting a local entrepreneur with enough capital to buy a piece of equipment.
It is an incredibly complex balancing act. I mean, we have covered a massive amount of ground today on this deep dive, tracing the veins of an economy that is operating on multiple, often conflicting tracks simultaneously.
It's the reality of modern development. There are no simple blueprints.
We started by looking at a state budget, terrifyingly reliant on a fading oil industry, forcing the government to lean heavily on automatic stabilizers, taking on massive short-term debt, just to absorb the shock of recessions without collapsing the domestic economy.
The car suspension analogy holding it all together.
Right, and then we navigated the counterintuitive turbulence of floating exchange rates, exploring why a plunging peso actually worsens the trade deficit in the short run due to inelastic contracts, before the J-curve finally swings upward into a manufacturing surplus.
All while billions of dollars in remittances flow directly into the pockets of families, acting as a crucial macroeconomic safety net.
And we traced the massive, messy evolution of North American trade, from the laissez-faire era of NAFTA that modernized the North but decimated the agricultural South, to the unprecedented forceful intervention of the USMCA, which is literally dictating a $16 hourly wage to force a more equitable distribution of wealth.
And we confronted the stubborn reality of the Gini coefficient and the informal economy. Recognizing that top-down macroeconomic growth is utterly insufficient unless it is paired with targeted micro-level interventions like rural finance to finally shatter the poverty cycle.
It is a machine in the middle of a massive recalibration. So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you watch this region develop. As the global green energy transition accelerates and Mexico's traditional oil revenues continue to face an existential threat, where does the future growth come from? Will the aggressive top-down wage mandates of the USMCA, combined with the slow, bottom-up empowerment of rural microfinance, be enough to finally formalize the millions of people trapped in the shadow economy? Can Mexico finally tune the suspension of its economic engine perfectly enough to overcome the massive structural potholes ahead? The blueprint is changing, and the entire world is watching the results. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.